I'm not going to talk about the entire 50 years because I'm only around for the first half. And I'll go back to the earlier days because I'm sure that most of you probably weren't even born then. So we'll start with 1939. That was an important year. First of all, Richard Fonda Woolley was appointed director of the Mount Stromlo Observatory in Australia. I think most of you should know who Richard was. He's responsible for what's here now. And he was director of Mount Stromlo until 1956. But in 1939, another event happened, but it never made the news. I was born. Okay, so let's start with what I point up there. Come on. What happened to my slide? Okay, so 1950, the next person who appears relevant is Dr. Stoy. He was appointed Her Majesty's astronomer here in 1950. And at the time, this observatory was known as the Royal Observatory, so he was Her Majesty's astronomer. And it was under control of the British Admiralty. In 1956, Sir Richard Woolley, who was a South African incidentally and did his MSc at the University of Cape Town, retired from, or changed from Mount Stromlo to becoming Astronomer Royal at the Royal Greenwich Observatory in England. He then pressed for the Cape to be put under his control, I suppose we could call it. And Cape became known as a branch of the Royal Observatory, Greenwich. So after Sir Richard Woolley, well, he was only became Sir towards the end of his life. So when I talked to him, Sir, he wasn't Sir then. But after being appointed Astronomer Royal, the British people who control whatever happened in the science asked him for his recommendations as to how astronomy should go forward. And he came forward with the proposal that a 150-inch telescope reflector be installed in the southern hemisphere, or alternatively a 100-inch reflector with a 48-inch Smith telescope. And obviously the two possible sites were South Africa and Australia, but because Sir Richard was Australian biased, he favoured Australia. So Stoy wasn't too happy with the way winds were blowing because he could possibly foretell what was the future for the observatory here. In 1967, the Australians came forward with a proposal for a telescope at Siding Spring in Australia in conjunction with the British people, and they got the 153-inch telescope and a 48-inch Smith. In 1968, the organisation that controlled the distribution of funds for the Science Research Council in England decided that they could not afford to finance both the Australian telescope and an observatory in South Africa. And the proposal made was that the South African observatory be shut down. This caused a great deal of unhappiness. Dr. Stoy, who, as I was director from, well, Her Majesty's astronomer from 1950, resigned and moved off to the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh, where he's Deputy Director. The Chief Assistant here, Dr. David S. Evans, in Texas, University of Texas, and Deputy Director at the Untitled Observatory. So the way was now clear for Sir Richard to pursue his plans. I must point out that Sir Richard and I were not on too good at terms. But I think that was fairly common at the time. He was a rather gruff character, and what he said went. So let's see. We've come to resignation. Okay, so Dr. Alan Cousins, astronomer here, was temporary director for acting head for a few months before George Harding came out from Greenwich. Now, George Harding was a real gentleman and the ideal person to deal with the staff because they were not happy at finding out that they are now going to be without jobs because the observatory was going to close. At the same time, the Redcliffe Board of Trustees set up the Redcliffe Observatory Victoria, originally planned in 1935, but only came into operation in 1948 as a result of World War II. Now, the Redcliffe Board of Trustees had limited money, so limited, in fact, that they could not afford to employ a gardener or anything at the observatory in Victoria. So an agreement was made between the observatory here and Victoria that astronomers here would get time on the Victoria Telescope. That's, you would have heard about that from Robin Catchpole. So he did a lot of work at Victoria, and there was quite a big collaboration between Redcliffe and the Cape. Then, just got to make sure I go in the correct sequence. So the Cape Observatory was now scheduled to be closed. Then in 1968, the CSIR summoned Sir Richard and George Harding to Victoria, and a proposal was made that the CSIR would take over the observatory here, pay some of the funding. In return, the observatory was to become known as the South African Astronomical Observatory, and the Republic Observatory in Johannesburg was to close. And Sir Richard Woolley would be appointed director because at the end of 1971, he retired from being Her Majesty's astronomer, the Astronomer Royal at the observatory in England. Now, I came to the story first in 1962 when I worked here for a month as a university student. I stayed with Dr. Stoy, a very nice gentleman. His wife was she and I didn't get on too well, but we won't go into that. And I lived in the main building. My bedroom was upstairs, one of the upstairs rooms, because at that time there was no director's house. And I remember one morning when we were having breakfast, Dr. Stoy's wife made some comment, and then I made an adverse comment. And I got such a dirty look from her. Her daughter also attacked me, and he sat there with a big grin on his face. So I then I was here for only a month, and then I went off to finish my university and mess around before I accepted an appointment at the observatory in Johannesburg, Republic Observatory, where I was given the job of managing the International Planetary Patrol Program for the Lowell Observatory under contract to NASA for a period of 5 years. So I took appointment in early 1969. This caused some complication because the CSIR had decided that the Republic Observatory was to shut down but they were under obligation to finish this contract. So the Republic Observatory stayed in sort of operation until 1974 when I finished the program. The astronomers at the Republic Observatory, or the staff there, were not happy with suddenly being informed, you're out of job. This observatory is being closed down, and if you want to, you can transfer to Cape Town. And obviously, astronomers close to retirement at their own houses, they were not keen, and the majority of them moved out elsewhere. For me, it was not a problem. I say I still had 3 years of the contract to go. Then I would have to decide what I was going to do. At the end of it, I did go to Bloemfontein for an interview at Boyden Observatory. I was offered the job of resident astronomer. But I was told that the observatory was on a limited budget. It was financed internationally, and the future was uncertain. So I thought, no, I can't take a chance there. And I turned it down. The subsequent years, the observatory was taken over by the University of Free State, and is still operated by them. So in 1972, beginning of 1972, Sir Richard arrived in the Cape, and a function was held here. Astronomers from all over the world attended. I was invited, but that's only because I was from the Republic Observatory, an insignificant person that was prepared to come. So I flew down along with George Nicholson from the Radio Astronomy Observatory. And there was a function that night where all the big wigs were there. And then the next morning we went up to Sutherland by car, Joe Turns being the driver. And of course we got to Sutherland at its worst.
Okay, sir.
Cloudy, misty, snow under mud. And we went up to the plateau, waded through the mud, and all that was up at that time was the 3 main buildings. What was it, 20, the 30, the 40 eventually, but only up to roof level. It didn't have the domes. So it was pretty difficult. So we went back to the hotel of Sutherland, and we had the best night's sleep I ever had. Mattress must have been at least 1 meter thick, and you just disappeared and you didn't see the outside world. Next morning we went up at Sutherland, then at its best. Beautiful blue sky, a bit of a chilly wind, and everything looked a little bit nicer. Went back to Cape Town, now we went back to Joburg, until I came down in 1974. In the interim, George Harding went around trying to persuade people to move. He came up to Joburg, I was interviewed, and I was quite happy to come down to the observatory. But I had problems, but he said they would be able to meet them. Anyway, let's just show you. That's the observatory in the mid-50s. In those days, we still had electricity. You can see the power station right at the top there, by the UR screen sharing. That was the old power station. Whoops. Okay, this shows 2 directors. Feast on the right hand, or that side. There was at the Radcliffe Observatory, and Thackeray also was director of the Radcliffe Observatory. So they're pretty young there. That's the Radcliffe Observatory in Victoria. Of course, the Radcliffe Observatory is now at the top of Sutherland. That is the 26.5-inch Innes refractor at the Republic Observatory, telescope that I used for the planetary patrol for 5 years. It was a bit of a primitive instrument to use, especially when we had to reverse the telescope over the axis several times during the night, depending on whether the planet was on the eastern or western side of the pier. So the dome took one hell of a bashing, and some of the sheets on the side worked loose, and whenever it rotated, you heard the clang, clang, clang. The whole neighborhood could hear the dome being moved. It also had a rising floor, unlike the one now where the whole floor rises, hydronic system. This telescope is still at the observatory in observatory in Johannesburg. It's used by the amateurs sometimes. That's the Republic Observatory in its prime. The big dome, of course, houses the big refractor. The middle one is where 20 inches, that was at Sutherland, and the extreme dome there housed a 6 or 7 inch refractor. I had the pleasure, or I was lucky, I lived in a double-story house. I was the director, only because there's nobody else. I was there as just to carry out my task. This place has changed quite a bit since, and as you know, it's no longer an observatory, although they cannot get rid of the telescope because of the terms of which the land was given to South Africa. Another view of the observatory. I don't think the CSAO anticipated shutting it down so early, because just prior to my coming to the observatory, they added this entire new complex. So this observatory was also housed the time service for the country. Those of you that don't have start rates, NUO, time signals from 5, 10, 50 megahertz, megacycle, whatever. And I used to cause some trouble because I used to receive satellite weather pictures during the day, and I used to have severe interference from the local transmitter, which was just a few yards up the hill. I used to switch the transmitter for 15 minutes during the day, so people lost their time signal and didn't know what happened to it. I was the culprit. That's John Harris. He was acting director at the Republic Observatory, originally employed as an engineer, electrical engineer at the SABC. He developed, for that time, a very accurate clock, crystal control quartz clock. And he was in charge of the observatory as acting director. He was not an astronomer, although subsequent to his retirement, he became very active in variable star work. So when the observatory was shut down, officially at the beginning of 1972, he was moved to the CSIR in Pretoria, along with 1 or 2 people from the electronics department who were prepared to move. Most of the astronomers resigned or stayed a year or 2 to serve out their retirement. One was Knight, Graham Knight. He died about a year later from asthma attack. And the other one was Revere, who carried out minor planet work at the Hartbeespoort Twin Dam, Franklin Adams camera. He eventually retired and went to Bloemfontein. That's George Harding, a very nice gentleman, and had quite a good reputation for building observatories. He was quite instrumental in setting up what happened here at Sutherland. And when he left, he carried on with his work in the Northern Hemisphere, so Dr. Palmer, who was actually setting that up. So now we are in 72. Yeah, so prior to the CSIR deciding to take over the observatory in 1972, Willie and Harding had decided that the programs at the Cape would be terminated by 1972 and the observatory completely shut down by 1974. At that time, a lot of astronomers came from Britain or came from Radcliffe, and there was quite a large foreign contingent here, and they all eventually moved. The observatory owned several houses in Pinelands for stock. They sold those off and they disappeared. So let's see. Forgive me for looking at my notes here, otherwise I get lost. So Willie came down in January 1972 and served as the director till 1974. And he was then replaced by Mike Beast. In 1974, the Radcliffe Board of Trustees decided to sell the Radcliffe 74-inch to the SAAO, and that was moved down to Sutherland and became operational in 1976. In March 1973, the observatory at Sutherland was officially opened. The Prime Minister was B.J. Foster. Margaret Thatcher was there, although she was in charge of education and science, and was attended by quite a few people, all bigwigs. So the next thing was for telescopes to be sited at Sutherland. This was the original MRM. This had been set up in Cape Town. Now, some of it, this may be applied to somebody. Does anybody know where the parallax store was? The plate store was? No. That's where I think you have your IT now on the top floor. It's a little building as you come down the steps from the main building. That used to be the plate store, and this used to be on top. The idea, I'm not too sure when the MRM mount was acquired. I couldn't find any record of it. But it was purchased to carry the cameras that would normally have been carried on top of Harvey, McLean, or the astrographic. This one on the my right-hand side, I have no idea what it is. It looks pretty cumbersome. And they did carry out a program, photographing the sky, I think, in blue and yellow. Because when I arrived at the observatory in 1974, I was given the task of measuring the plates, rough measuring, and they were to be sent to, again, Edinburgh, where they'd be measured with a precise measuring machine. As far as I know, this project was never completed. Anyway, the MRM mounting was moved to the middle dome at Sutherland, and it remained as such until 1975, when a 30-inch reflector was purchased and installed. What the telescope did in 1972 to 75, I don't know. Maybe they carried on with this blue and yellow sky survey, where they're photographing a whole visible sky. But as I said, I think it disappeared. This is the 40-inch telescope. I'm ancient, so I still use inches. To me, 40 inches is more accurate than 1 meter. So this was set up in the grounds here. Originally decided upon in 1953. So it was called the Elizabeth Telescope for obvious reasons. And it got set up in a dome that came from the Greenwich Observatory that covered what they called the Apt Telescope, YAPP. Now, the telescope was ordered in 1958 and was set up in Cape Town at the end of 1963. I never saw this in operation because I wasn't around at that time. I'm sure the individual there is David Evans. He had a distinctive crop of hair, which it was difficult to avoid. Boris Johnson looked bad. A little bit better. So this was, while I was still young, this building was pulled down. This is where the technical building is now. And the 40-inch was moved to Sutherland. And then the 20-inch came from the Public Observatory in Johannesburg. It was moved while I was still there, because I took photographs of it being taken out of the dome and lowered to the ground. Then we had the opening in March 1973, as I say, Foster was there. And this is what was present at that time, the two chalets and the resident staff building. There was no hostel, and they had started on the technical building. MR multiple refractor mounting. Margaret Thatcher. So Woolly is the first character here. I'm not too sure. I think it might be below. I'm not too sure. I think that was B.J. Foster. I never met him anyway. And that was a sign that stood outside. It's a little bit different today. And the telescopes, the 40-inch, 30, and the 20. The technical building and construction. And this was the 20-inch telescope. And a chap observing is Drummond Land, who was one of my colleagues. He and I had a sort of informal competition as to who went to Sutherland the most. We were junior staff, and we were sent to be server observers for the big shots. So we got observing time whether we wanted it or not. A minimum of two weeks per quarter. And he carried out all the photometry, UV-VRI. UV-VRI, that's visual. While I was employed on the 30-inch to do JHKL infrared photometry. But for the first few years, I was excused duties at Sutherland from 1972 to 1977. My wife was severely epileptic, and it was quite a job to leave her at home and be away for a week at a time. And when I agreed to come down to Cape Town, I said I wanted to be excused from Sutherland observing duties. And I managed to evade that for the first 5 years. So what happened at Sutherland before 1977, I don't know. In those days, we used to travel up by combi. And this turned out to be quite dangerous. On one of the trips in 1978, the combi overturned on the dirt road between Sutherland and the observatory, and Dr. Andrew Thackeray was killed. And one or two astronomers were severely injured with Bologna, for example. So we did away with combis. There was also a proposal that we use a light aeroplane every week, landing on the road at the top. But thank heavens, that never arrived, it never happened. Although I think in that one plane did actually do the trip once. I don't know what the procedure is today, but as I retired in 1999, a lot has changed. When I retired, the Sutherland the Apk Telescope did not exist. It had been discussed, but construction had not even started. So we used to hopefully try and depart 10 o'clock in the morning on a Monday. But astronomers are most unreliable people. Some of them couldn't find their observing schedule for the week. Others, their instrument wasn't ready. So we got away early. We were lucky. The idea was that we get to stop at Toes River for petrol, and then at Fontaine, have our lunch, and then arrive at Sutherland Observatory about 3:30 in the afternoon. We used to get a good lunch at Fontaine, usually bangers and mash. We also used to get a free cheese plate, but one lot of staff, not astronomers from the observatory, celebrated a little bit too much and had a cheese fight in the bar. After that, there was no more free cheese plate. So, as I said, we get to the observatory, and as probably still now, do you stay up the whole Monday night? Or do you have a good night's sleep and try and survive from then on? And then, of course, Tuesday, you have to set your instruments up and whatever you have to do. Not everybody was allowed to drive. We did have some eccentric astronomers who sort of wanted to jog the wheel the moment they saw a car approaching them, so they weren't allowed to drive. We had one astronomer who he used to go out on a porch outside the lounge at the hostel and complain about the wooden rails above the trellis. He couldn't see the stars because too lazy to step off the platform onto the ground. He eventually went to Eskom. Maybe that's why Eskom is what it is today. I won't mention any names. I'm sure you know most people, I won't know who it is. Right, so at that time we went over the pass. The Huguenot tunnel had not yet been constructed, and the combi used to sometimes battle right up the hill. Then the combi couldn't do it, run down the bottom and try again. Once or twice we had to come back to Cape Town to get another combi. But once the Huguenot tunnel was opened, that made a big improvement. And then they subsequently improved the road to the freeway it was when I used to drive in class. I don't know what it's like now with potholes, maybe it's still kept in good condition. Well, being in the Western Cape, it should be in good condition. Because all the roads here are good, not like Transvaal where the holes are big enough to swim in. The road between Sutherland and the observatory was a dirt road, as I mentioned, and only was tarred after I retired. So there were several accidents along that road. I say the one in which the combi rolled. I was in one car, we came back, it rained, snowing very heavily, and we could barely see where we were going, but we weren't going to stay there longer than we had to. And we had a British astronomer with him, and we reasoned that since he came from Britain, he knew how to drive in snow. So he was appointed as driver, barely got out the gate when he drifted into the donga. We managed to get the car out and continue our way back to Cape Town. Another incident we had, you heard about the Locust Plagues. We saw several of those in the years that I was there. Sometimes you just couldn't see where you were driving, and the sky became dark. Another thing was dust storms, dust down from the Sahara. And of course, this messed up photometry because everything, all the valued constants changed. How's the time going?
12:34.
Okay, I'm going. Okay, so this is a 20-inch. I believe it's now been moved to Boyden Observatory. I don't know if it's doing anything. That was a 30-inch. This was when it still had the counterweight. When I went there, they had put the telescopes from MRM onto it. And this telescope was famous because of these long telescopes on the counterweight side, because we always collided with them in the dark. At the base of it was surrounded in thick plastic, and the sign on it, "Give blood." That happened frequently. I collided with one day ducking underneath, coming up too soon, it got me in my back and broke his spine, one of the fingers of my spine. But this wasn't the only telescope that was dangerous. Thackeray, no, not Thackeray, I believe Priest fell off the observing platform in 74-inch and lay on the ground for some time before being discovered. Nothing was badly hurt, other than maybe the leg stretched a bit more than you wanted. That was a 40-inch. That's George Harding. That director for Observatory, you can see it's an old photograph, it's an old false photo. Had quite a lot of trouble with this one. Whenever wind came along, it blow the panels off. So staff had to do quite a lot of work in restoring the panels. Of course, you all recognize that telescope, the original rectus. Right, now what happened while I was there? Of course, the main thing was the Supernova of 1987. It happened in February, discovered, I think, in South America. John Menzies got the first spectrum of it. Brightest supernova since Kepler's one. It's the bright yellow star there, and then the Magellanic Cloud. And everybody went mad. And for several months, most of the telescopes concentrated on especially infrared. And we used to use this when it was at its later, at minimum altitude. As a result of it, sort of had to climb on top of the pier, or the polar axis, in order to be able to get to the eyepiece. So it was quite dangerous. I was also involved, dragged into it by John Menzies, and I had to work on the expansion rings that were produced by the supernova. That was the infrared team at the time. Feast, Dave Laney, a Mormon who eventually left and went back to the States. Astronomer there, I think he must be retired by now. The one with the glasses, tall one, we won't mention who that is. That was a nice and fit. That one on the right-hand side, Jonathan Spencer Jones, grandson of Sir Harold Spencer Jones, who was a famous astronomer. Brian Carter, who was in the same salary structure as mine, and he moved off to the Carter Observatory in New Zealand. Then Patricia Whitelock, you all know Patricia, and then Robin Catchpole. Okay, now we come to the Halley's Comet and the Giotto space probe. Giotto was launched in March 1986 and was to approach within 600 kilometers of the nucleus of Halley's Comet. First time that there be a close flyby of a comet. The observatory here had this task of doing astrometry, which had determining the position of the comet so that the trajectory of the Giotto spacecraft could be planned properly. So that kept us busy in the astrometry department. Then, closer to the time that flyby was to occur, International Halley Watch was set up, and they discovered that there was a big gap where South Africa was. So the University of Pereira in Italy offered to lend a 25-30 Schmidt camera. There's a sad story, not a sad story, but the person who was supposed to set it up didn't set it up. He was too busy doing other things, I won't mention name. And I was given the job of setting it up. So he was very popular with me. Anyway, I had to set up the camera, focus it, work out how to sensitize the little plates and how to put them at the focus of the telescope. This is one of the early photographs taken. This was taken by Fred Moran. At that time, they had a small little telescope set out in the belt before we used the camera from Italy. That is a photograph I took. I think it was something like a 40-minute exposure, which I did manually. Not perfect, as you can see with the star trails. And ended up almost with a broken neck. It was the longest exposure that we did. We put together, carried out 86 exposures. And it was a task of the observer on the petty edge to at least photograph the comet once or twice a night. So for a period of about 3 months, we got a total of 86 photographs, 5 on a night of close flyby. Right, now we come to the Apk Telescope. At about this time, the construction of Apk Telescopes was quite popular, and the observatory decided to set up its own one. The mirror was ground at the SAAO in Pretoria by a chap who had no experience of grinding a mirror, and it took him a long time. But I think he finally got it right up. I don't know what the quality is like, but I haven't heard any complaints. And then the telescope was constructed, the frame and the drive was constructed in the workshop here. As Digby Ellis, who was one of the draftsmen here, he left on it. I don't know why, I can't remember why he left, but a young lady who was associated with the person from whom I purchased my first computer was given the task of developing the algorithm that they could use to identify the star field. Plates, so they knew where the camera was pointing. Of course, this is old hat nowadays, but at that time it was leading technology. This, I believe, is now called the Alan Cousins Telescope. The next event was the Shoemaker levy impact. Shoemaker levy were two amateurs who observed part-time and looked around comets. And they found this comet, which was named after them. And the unique thing about the comet was that it consisted of several fragments. It had a place within the gravitational field of Jupiter, and the comet had been torn apart. And the gravitational pull drew these fragments in towards Jupiter and eventually impacted. So over a period of about a week, we had one after another impact of one of these fragments, only about 2 kilometers in diameter, but they produced quite a spectacular show. This is the first one that we observed. You see the red spot there in the middle, or to the side. And of course, there's two satellites visible. One satellite visible, and then the impact point on the limb. Kazuyuki, Japanese astronomer, he took the photographs on 30 inch. John Wensley's made this assembly, and I added the color. Initially, I observed on the 30-inch infrared program for about 10 years or so for Feast. I can't say I enjoyed it. It was the worst telescope to use. It was also the coldest. Because we worked in infrared, you weren't allowed to have any heat on you. Couldn't wear a heated observing suit. And when you're on top of that ladder, looking straight to the north, you had this freezing wind coming, and you had icicles on the end of your nose. So, and also it had the longest observing hours because we could start well before the sun set, and we could observe into daylight, being an infrared. So that was hard work. So in that case, I earned my salary. But when I wasn't at Sutherland, I didn't earn my salary because I was on the computer, on the internet all the time. There's the Alan Cousins Telescope. No, that's the far one. The one in front here is the one set up by the Birmingham people to observe solar oscillations. I guess it's probably still operational, although I'm sure the chap who initialized probably died a long time ago. But he was a regular observer to the observatory. These last two photographs were taken on my last day at Sutherland. So it shows the observatory as it was then, hostel, the chalets, and the technical building and the residence. You all know what the storms are like at Sutherland. In the early days, this created severe problems because every time there was an electrical storm, the entire electronics place was blown up. So they eventually had to put everything underground. We also had the Langsberg flood. That was in 1981, January 25, when something like 425 millimeters of rain fell in about a 24-hour spell, and usual flash flood came down and drowned at least 100 people in tanks. We were marooned at Sutherland. The road between Sutherland and Montefontaine was mostly washed away. So John and Lang and myself decided, no, we're not going to stay there longer than we had to. So we went around a long way. It took us something like 12 hours driving across the veld to 3 or 4 all night rest. We got back okay. I think it's the only time it's ever been done. And of course, we all know about the snow. The worst thing about the snow was that it would snow everywhere, the snow, then suddenly it would clear. Then you've got to go and observe it. And it's freezing. I mean, the temperature often at night in the dark was -5. I mean, no exaggeration. I cheated sometimes. I had a little heater, which I put on from time to time. Nobody complained about it, so I don't think they were aware of it. This is Langsburg Road. You see the railway line. Bridge there had been washed away. So Natal isn't the only place to have floods. Then we come to the seed tests. When Bob Stobie became director, the possibility of a large telescope being set up at Sutherland was investigated. And it was decided to model it on the telescope in the United States. And SAAO, Large Telescope. I wasn't involved with it, but I was involved with the site testing. We started in 1992 with a small 3.5-inch Questar reflector, and the idea was to do time exposure on a bright equatorial star as the star drifted across the field. And the twinkling or the seeing would produce variations in the width of the trail, and that would be measured. But it wasn't very accurate, probably accurate about 1.5 arc seconds. A few years later, we came up with DIM and the DIM telescope. I was given the task of setting it up. I had to order the telescope from the States, set it up, found a seeing here in Cape Town, was around about 12 arc seconds. Very, very poor seeing here. I don't know, well, we know why the observatory was established here, not for astronomical, but to see the cannonball in the harbour timing. So the DIM telescope was operated until after I left. I had to do the reduction of the images, which was later on taken over by Cooper. Then I believe subsequent to that, they came along with DIM 2 and find out where the best seeing was on the plateau, usually around about 1 arc second. And they decided where to site the actual telescope. Well, that's when I left, as I say, the 74-inch 3 telescopes. Aerial view. Another aerial view. Another aerial view. This is, I had to produce a representation of what salt would look like. This is where they were going to put it. But, you know, they put it much further on the plateau. That's about the seed tests. The original telescope used for doing the seed test, the Questar, was used on the Hunter's Mountain in Southwest Africa, which was considered a possible site. But fortunately, we never went there. We'll see. I don't know if the site still exists. At the risk of being sexist, I've seen another sign that says fasten your bra as well, but not on this one. And of course, our Springbok, I presume they're still there. One winter was extremely cold, heavy snow, and these creatures really suffered. They literally froze to death. He used to come onto the patio in the quadrangle at the hostel. They used to lie there in addition to die. I presume the staff enjoyed the meals, ate them up, but it was a very difficult time for them. We actually put food out for them, bales of hay in the garage they put on top of the plateau. I'm sure you all may have encountered the bird that has a nest above the quadrangle, and when you come outside then you've got eggs in the nest and down on you. I'm sure it's not the same bird, but probably several generations later. You've all heard about Robin Stonehenge. I'm sure Robin told you about it. He and Tom Lloyd Evans were archaeologists, and they used to go exploring, looking around for different caves and all the rest. And one day Robin decided to build his own Stonehenge. I was there at the time. I didn't help him because I'm too lazy. But he must have spent a lot of energy collecting those stones and those pillars. We used to have brass fixed. Clearly, the idea was that the technical staff would do the braai and the astronomers would do the eating. We often had filming crews there who liked to use the backdrop of the observatory as to give the advert some respectability. I didn't enjoy it because one night I had to go with my telescope and I told them to bugger off. I had work to do. I wasn't going to play around with filming. So I wasn't popular there. And now the question of visitors. In those days, people could just roll up and catch somebody. So over the weekend, you'd find the whole plateau was empty. You couldn't find an astronomer anywhere. They were all hiding away so they wouldn't have to take visitors around. Eventually, it was changed to the technical staff. They had to conduct the tours. Then the question of night telephone calls. At that time, the exchange in Sutherland only had one line up to the observatory, and usually went to 74-inch. And anybody who sighted anything on the observatory didn't want that light. It's an aeroplane light. And the astronomer had to abandon what he's doing and talk to the public. Eventually, this was the 74-inch people objected that it was put through to the either the 30-inch or 20-inch. Myself, Fred Meringue, or Francis Van Beek. We dealt with these calls. Then we had the famous midnight safety checks, where again, one of the junior astronomers, if there were any on site, had to phone the other observers to find out, are they okay? If they've got no reply, go over there and find out if they're lying dead on the floor or not. Fortunately, we didn't have any real problems there. I think I mentioned the poor transparency from the dust storms. And of course, at that time, several volcanoes erupted, I think, Minnesota. And we had glorious sunsets, but completely red photometry. Light visible from Sutherland. If you go to a certain place, you can see the lights. We never able to establish whether it was Cape Town or Worcester. Maybe that's been sorted out now. And during periods of maximum solar activity, we could see aurora. John Menzies apparently saw it. So I think that's all I've got to say. As I retired in October 1999, and I haven't had much to do with the observatory since, so I'm aware of what has happened subsequently, but to my disgrace, I have not been back to Sutherland since my last trip in 1999. One day I said I'll take my wife there, but who knows? Okay. Anybody got any questions? I'll try to give a censored version of what happened. But I had lots of other things going on, but some things are best left unsaid. Okay. Right, and I'm finished. All going to have your lunch. I will feed my little.
I'm not sure. I think first I must thank you for a wonderful and very informative presentation. You didn't want to give us the science highlights, but the history, the geography,
the politics involved,
the culture, and the politics. Thank you so much. We have been talking from last year, trying to arrange this talk. I'm glad that we got
me. I'm sure John made it talk.
Yes.
Louis Balone is still alive. What it was last time. Official one.
Yes.
So you've got plenty of people.
Yeah, they are online actually. Yeah, they're on Zoom. Okay, colleagues, I just want to, if you have any questions, then I'll also ask the people on Zoom if you have any questions or then some have sent comments on the chat box. So I'll just check if there are any questions. Do you have any questions on this hybrid thing?
I'm glad there's no question.
Questions. Or it's just, I see, okay, there. Thank you so much. Excellent overview. Thank you from Dave. Next there, thank you so much. Very interesting talk.
Okay, good. No complaint. Okay. My wife complained. She said, I've spent a whole night talking in my sleep.
Or there is a question. They say, please tell us what your favorite time at the SAAO.
I guess the Shoemaker never impact. And that's the only time I ever really worked hard. I mean, I was working something like 18, 19 hours a day. I just used to go home to have a shower in our bed. Because I was the one collecting all the reports from the internet and printing out the photographs and the press wanted photographs and all that. So I even got a bonus this year.
Okay. And I saw that in one of the annual reports, it was using the cover of the old annual report.
Oh, yeah.
And they were taking
No, that was a good time, the best time. The biggest fright I ever had was I was observing one night in my train at 1 o'clock in the morning. Felt a tap on my shoulder. Turned around, he was a chap. He just walked in from the gates from Falkenberg and just walked into the dome. In those days, I didn't lock the door. He tapped me on the shoulder in the dark and then he died. After that, I kept the door locked.
Yeah. It's just,
and then I also mentioned the thing that Dr. Cousins is. He was very agile. He was well in his 90s, still observing. He used to observe on the train. And we had great difficulty opening the shutters. There were these ropes that he had to pull on. There's now been fixed, I believe. But he used to take a running jump and then hang on and duck onto them. Use his way to pull it down. At his age. He was a remarkable man. Okay.
Any other comments, colleagues? Any questions? Because I see people from Zoom. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. From thank you, correct?
Yeah, Billy is another one to talk. Billy's been here 35 years.
Yes.
So he knows all about it.
Okay.
And he's good at telling stories.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Okay.
I'm glad that's out the way. Now I can go back into hibernation.
Okay. Thank you so much for making this time. Thank you, colleagues, for joining in. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being tolerant.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.
There's lots of nice pictures there. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
You've got grace.
So you work in this place long enough.
You've been in a long time now. How many years have you been?
Officially, since 2006, but I started.
Oh, you got me long before that.
As a student, I mean, I remember one of my first observing months was one of your last months. And that was 99. 98.